This video was brought to you by Soccer Co, but more on them later. One of the greatest strengths of the Psychonauts franchise is its ability through its levels to invoke a reaction in you. Whether it's the frustration and repetition of Black Velvetopia, the paranoia of the Milkman conspiracy, or the anxiety of Compton's cook-off. Through Double Fine's show-don't-tell philosophy and level design, they're able to give you a lot of information well before it's explicitly told to you, and this rings true for when we enter the mind of the grand head of the Psychonauts, Truman Zanotto. It's here that Raz and Lili find themselves in what appears to be a backstage area surrounded by curtains that are immediately recognizable as the ones you would see in a theater. There are chalkboards saying things like, "I'm Truman Zanotto," and "Lili is your daughter," along with degrees, several mannequins, rolling wardrobe racks like you would see in any theater, and a giant full-length mirror, all surrounding a cracked stone bust of Truman Zanotto. It's uncanny, it's unnatural, it makes you feel claustrophobic and uncomfortable, because it's so profoundly not what most of us would have expected when we dove into this mind. And so we're given ample evidence that this may not be the mind we initially thought it would be, and instead, the purpose of this room is to be an isolated Truman Zanotto persona. However, the vast majority of this persona is constructed using very surface level information, which is why Truman has been acting so strange lately, only really interacting with people like Raz who didn't know the finer points of Truman's actual personality. Essentially, the research done on Truman by whoever's mind this actually is wasn't all that great, and this is represented by the cracks in the bust of Truman Zanotto that lies in the center of the room. And so once Raz starts chipping away at this flimsy material, this is when we see why there's a red velvet carpet leading up to this statue. Because underneath the likeness of Truman Zanotto, we uncover a shining golden statue of Nick from the mailroom, who we would soon learn is actually Gristol Malik, the heir to the Grulovian throne. So, with this reveal in mind, this room, while one of the smallest areas in the level, provides us with a firm foundation to begin understanding Gristol's personality and why he does what he does. With this golden bust of himself at the center of the room, not so subtly giving us the information that he has a very grandiose sense of self. And this in particular is something that I want us to keep at the back of our minds moving forward into the level, because this is the first of many indicators that Gristol could likely be diagnosed with a narcissistic personality disorder, which the DSM-5 defines as being a pervasive pattern of grandiosity in fantasy or behavior, the need for admiration, and a lack of empathy, beginning in early adulthood and present in a variety of contexts. In the actual diagnostic process, this is indicated by 5 or more pieces of criteria that are outlined more specifically within the DSM-5. But before we go any further with this video, I can't stress enough that while narcissistic personality disorder is heavily stigmatized in the modern world, just because someone is diagnosed with this particular personality disorder does not mean that they will be anything like Gristol, and all of the information shared in this video will be specifically contextualized for this character in particular, his upbringing, and the context the game gives us about his life in particular. So please don't use the information in this video to build preconceptions or prejudices against people with narcissistic personality disorders, because they're not all like Gristol. And don't use this information to diagnose either yourself or the people around you. If you're having concerns or something in this video strikes a chord with you, please connect with a mental health professional in your area. And so once Raz and Lili discover that without a doubt this is not Truman Zanotto's mind, they're swiftly vacuumed up and spat out onto another red carpet leading directly to an amusement park ride that is heavily inspired by Disneyland's It's a Small World. And this is when we see the real Gristol. And when Raz and Lili learn who he truly is, he unsurprisingly shoves his way past them and gets onto the ride himself, completely bypassing the cartoonishly long queue filled with figments as his gaudy Grulovian regal attire is slowly draped onto his body. While walking this this red carpet, this once again reinforces to us that Gristol has an incredibly grandiose sense of self-importance, as we see the ride operator quite literally bowing down to him as he simply walks to get onto the ride. This also points to another hallmark sign of narcissistic personality disorder, which is that Gristol requires an excessive amount of admiration from those around him. I mean, even if you look at the figments who are waiting in line, you can see that he perceives them all to be his avid supporters, with one even holding a banner that says his name on it. And so, when Raz eventually gets onto the ride himself, this is when we see the direct parallels to the It's a Small World ride in Disneyland. However, to understand how this ride really highlights Gristol's twisted perception of the world, we need to look at what the ride this level was based off of was meant to represent in the first place. It's a Small World is a ride intended to illustrate a global perspective, with children from dozens of countries across the globe singing the song in a wide variety of different languages, with Disney's intent being to illustrate that it truly is a small world after all. It's meant to be a cute, if not somewhat tedious, way of trying to show that while we all have our differences, we are citizens of the global community. But that's not exactly what Gristol's going for here. Throughout the course of this ride, we are fed things through Gristol's perspective. And so, to understand how he truly views the Grulovia he grew up in as a child, we first need to take a look at his first memory vault, as this will allow us to see why his perception of the Grulovian people is the way that it is. In this very first vault, we see that growing up, he was raised in the lap of luxury, with his father being the Zazarovich of Grulovia, with he and his family always having caviar nearby. In his memory, the people absolutely showered him with praise when he would make public appearances. He would teach the citizens of Grulovia all about the caviar he loved so incredibly much, even though they likely couldn't afford it themselves. He would ride a tiny pony around his kingdom with an attendant whose sole purpose was to hold his caviar for him. And let's be honest, while life price seemed like it was pretty good for the little fish-eating fiend, he wasn't at this time doing anything outright harmful or damaging. And so now it's time to take a quick Grulovian history lesson, as understanding the events of the Grulovian War and the Battle of Grulovia are absolutely essential for us to truly understand how Gristol became the man he is today and why he did the things that he did to reach this point. During the Grulovian War, we see in this first vault that malicious soldiers came to try and either abduct or kill him. And this was more so due to his parentage than because of anything that he had done. So when Maligula saved him from these invading soldiers during the war, she was appointed by Tsar Theodore, his father, to take the position of Grulovia's Minister of War. However, saving Gristol set off a domino effect of events that would eventually lead us to the main plot of Psychonauts 2. But suffice to say, in Gristol's mind, Lucretia was the savior of Grulovia and would be an asset to him when he eventually succeeded his father as the Tsar. While we know at this point in the game, the people of Grulovia began to peacefully protest Tsar Theodore's rule because he didn't have their best interest at heart, this is simply not how Gristol saw things from his side of the palace. Gristol was still perfectly content in his palace, eating caviar day in and day out. In his mind, everything was great until the Psychic Six came to get rid of Lucretia, the greatest general Grulovia had ever seen. And this is what caused he and his family to need to flee from the country, when in reality, that's not what actually happened. It was his father's poor treatment of the Grulovian people and his jealousy of the fact that, at least in his mind, the public seemed to prefer Lucretia to him, and that's what really caused this. And so as the protests began to ramp up, Tsar Theodore would continuously send Lucretia to use her hydrokinetic powers to quell these peaceful protests by having it rain on them. This, over time, caused the citizens to turn on Lucretia, who she was, up until recently, just another Grulovian citizen with psychic powers, and they began referring to her as Maligula, a name that she soon adopted herself because she liked the ring of it. Eventually, once Maligula's reign became too much, the Valermo Dam ended up bursting, causing countless casualties in its wake, with one of these casualties being Maligula's sister, which sent her spiraling, but that's a completely different topic for another video. Even once all of this happened, we see that Gristol was really nonplussed by all of it, and the fate of his people, which is a major red flag that we see in his past, showing us that even as a kid, there was some lack of empathy that was pervading his personality. While in other minds, we see that the protesters were protesting the fact that they were impoverished and just wanted some food and some of the wealth that the Tsar was withholding for himself and his family. In Gristol's memory and his mind's eye, their signs simply read things like blah 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 and problems, as they essentially were being wiped out by the deeds of Maligula, really showing that he didn't see any of their complaints of these humanitarian issues coming from the Tsar as real issues, and they were just kind of complaining and making noise. He had no empathy for their plight, and it's from here that Maligula's bloodlust grew to the extent that Tsar Theodore literally tried to have her assassinated out of his own fear of her. And when this didn't work, that's when he and his family fled for their own safety to the Lady Luctopus, and the Psychonauts had to step in to try and quell their former colleague's wrath. Now, I'll admit, that was a pretty lengthy explanation of Grulovian history and the events that occurred prior to the beginning of the story of Psychonauts, but without fully understanding these events, we can't truly get into the headspace of Gristol. Through this first segment of the ride, we come to fully understand that in his perception, Ford Cruller and the Psychonauts are completely at fault for the tragedies that befell Grulovia that led to his displacement. And added to this, the cherry on top was that it was because his father was weak as a leader that they had to flee. Now, this whole section of the ride is a fascinating peek into how Gristol not only views the events of his past, but also how he views the people around him during his time in Grulovia, and provides several hints that he currently has a narcissistic personality disorder that has not been addressed over the course of his life in any meaningful way. For instance, let's just look at how the Grulovian people are represented in his mind's eye. All of the figures that represent the Grulovian people lack any meaningful detail in any way, shape, or form. They're all cheaply constructed and only come in a total of 4 variations. One for a man, one for a woman, one for a young boy, and one for a young girl. And they're repeated throughout the entirety of the level. And this isn't even mentioning the fact that in the back room that we find when we're destroying the music boxes, we can see that there are broken props that represent the Grulovian citizens. This is significant because they didn't have to be shoddily constructed. It's his own mental world. They could have been as detailed or as undetailed as he wanted them to be. It's not like he was operating on a budget. He could have made the Grulovians just as detailed as the animatronics that he had made for himself and his family, or even the models representing Maligula and Ford Cruller, but he didn't. And I believe this is because he doesn't put much value onto the citizens of Grulovia themselves as individuals. But let's be honest, these beliefs didn't come out of nowhere. While individuals can definitely be biologically predisposed to a personality disorder, we can't exactly look at his family's medical history to prove that this is the case with Gristol. However, what we can prove is how his parents treated him growing up. Now, I think we're all familiar with just how incredibly important a parent's interactions with their children are to their development, and the Maliks are no different. In a study called Narcissistic Traits in Young People, Understanding the Role of Parenting and Maltreatment, researchers Charlotte C. Van Schie, Heidi L. Jarman, Elizabeth Huxley, and Brian F.S. Grenier found that a parent's overvaluation, or in other words, their unconditional praise, when combined with a lack of parental warmth and caring for their child's basic interpersonal needs, is strongly linked with the development of grandiose narcissism like we see in Gristol. While we don't get to see as much of his relationships with his parents as I would personally like, I think that even this is very telling. The closest thing that we see to Gristol actually interacting with his parents in a meaningful way is sitting on the throne room with them or in very posed and artificial settings. Besides this, we see them fleeing from the country together, and a resentful Gristol sitting at his father's deathbed. While I'll admit I'm inferring a little bit here, I think it's pretty safe to assume, based on how his father treated the citizens of Grulovia, that his parents fed into this idea that the Maliks, and so by extension Gristol, were better than everyone else in the country. And at the same time, Gristol seemed like he was often left unattended, entertaining himself in his own very caviar-centric ways. A well-known aspect of narcissistic personality disorder is that the individual, or Gristol in this particular scenario, will believe that he is special and unique and can only be understood or should associate with other special or high-status people. I would say this checks out because, again, the only figures with full-blown and highly detailed models in his mind are his family, Maligula, Ford, and Truman Zanotto. All people, regardless of his feelings for them, that he considers to be of higher importance or status. And so, in the back of our minds, I think we should constantly be thinking about how much of what Gristol would come to be is based on his inherent nature, and how much was caused by a household that poorly nurtured him. But with all of this devastation left behind him in the wake of Maligula's wrath, we now need to look towards how he will cope with the loss of his claim to the Grulovian throne. And as we find out in the next segment of this ride, it's not very well. Now, as we enter this area, we need to talk about propaganda, because this portion of his mind shows us not only his own beliefs, but also how he feels he can rewrite history once he stakes his claim as the rightful Tsar of Grulovia, after he resurrects Maligula. We see him leaning into this idea of portraying the Psychonauts as these boogeyman-like villains and the enemies of Grulovia, and blaming them for everything that the royal family and Maligula had done to the Grulovian people. I mean, there could be an entire video discussing how this portion mirrors how real-world regimes have manipulated and controlled their people throughout history. If we look at the American Psychological Association's definition of propaganda, they explain it as being a method of social control that attempts to strengthen or change the beliefs, attitudes, and actions of others by presenting highly biased information or sometimes disinformation. It usually involves an appeal to emotion that is designed to win support for an idea or course of action, or to belittle or disparage the ideas or programs of others. And this is exactly what he plans to do. And you can tell that this is an incredibly premeditated story that he has constructed to garner sympathy. We're experiencing the tragedy of a noble family and how they just had to flee to survive as their country was thrust into chaos by the Psychonauts. The ride's narrator throws his father under the bus, stating that had Tsar Theodore supported Maligula more, then perhaps the country would not have fallen into disarray. Gristol's mind is really trying to play on your heartstrings by showing us just how arduous a journey he had to endure while his family was fleeing Grulovia, and illustrates to us a sad scene of his father's death. This establishes without a doubt how interpersonally exploitative Gristol really is, which is something that is very much a through line with his character when we think back on his interactions with Raz up to this point in the story while he was posing as Truman Zanotto. I mean, it's hard to deny that he really does see himself as the hero who has suffered immensely, but also he is showing us how he will spin this tale to get exactly what he wants once Maligula returns. I mean, I think that the fact that Raz and Lili are able to change the terrain or change the story of Gristol's great suffering to look however they want it to serve whatever purposes they need gives us a very distinct understanding of just how malleable this sympathetic tale truly is in Gristol's mind. It's not like he's unaware of how exploitative this story is. He knows. He actively knows, which is why the employees who are literally wearing these gross Gristol Malik suits are referred to as being propagandineers, which is another tongue-in-cheek reference to Disney's Imagineers. When Raz is actually able to get out of the ride, the propagandineer is waiting to tell him that he's currently working on creating a future chapter of the ride that shows the unimaginable riches that the people of Grulovia will experience once Maligula and Gristol return. Again, this sounds great on paper, share the wealth. But really, this is all just a thinly veiled manipulation tactic that he has internalized to eventually get the people's support. And on top of this, I think that this room, meant for the future of the country, shows Gristol's excessive sense of entitlement. Not only does he believe that the moment he takes over his country again, he will be the Tsar and showered with riches, unreasonably believing that the people of Grulovia will automatically comply with his expectations, even faced by the might of Maligula. And so to progress through the level, Raz is told that the best eggs Gristol has ever had were found in the ocean. And so Raz and Lili manipulate Gristol's story for their own benefit so that Raz can get up to where he needs to go to get these eggs. And this is when we see the truth of Gristol's situation once they were exiled. He was never thrown into poverty or squalor. He and his family were simply holed up in the Lady Luctopus, the high-end casino that we had visited earlier in the game. This moment reveals to us that Gristol was the delusionist whose room they had found during this early portion of the game. But it also showed us that Gristol had absolutely no remorse for the death of his father. This sincere lack of empathy for his dad, who he believed is the reason that he did not ascend to the position of Tsar, shows us that Gristol's ideations of power and prestige far outweigh the value he put into his own father's life, even though, yeah, admittedly, they probably didn't have the best relationship. And then once Gristol recognizes that Raz is Grulovian, he offers to give Raz some caviar. And honestly, I think that while Gristol's obsession with the caviar is definitely a bit excessive, I do think that sometimes we all deserve to treat ourselves to some high quality snacks. Which brings us to today's sponsor, Sakura Co. Sakura Co is a monthly Japanese subscription box full of authentic, traditional, and wholesome Japanese snacks from Japan's local artisan snack makers. And so I wanted to go through this month's box with you. Because, as you can see, first off, the packaging on these boxes is absolutely immaculate. And when we actually go into it, we can see that it always comes with a beautiful piece of artwork, as well as this 24-page informative booklet that tells you all about the different snacks in the box, as well as giving you a lot of really fantastic information about Japanese culture. And so looking through this box, which is absolutely teeming with snacks, the first thing that catches my eye is right at the top here, and it's this Sakura Baumkuchen. It's a really moist kind of pastry. And I just want to take a quick bite of it. Oh my god, that's spectacular. It's really moist, and the booklet here tells me exactly what is in it. And it says that it has a nice, elegant flavor and accent of cherry blossom, which I definitely get from that. Oh, that's really, really good. And the next thing that I want to show you is that every single box of Sakura Co comes with a piece of kitchenware. Oh my god. Look at how nice that is. That's really pretty. So after having looked through this booklet a little bit more, something that really caught my eye was this Sakura Manju, which you can see it comes with 3 of them. And so if it's something that you really like and want to share with a friend, it's perfect to do that. And so this one's a little bit more firm than the last one. Oh my god. I don't know what I was expecting, but it's got the perfect amount of chewiness to it. I don't know, I may not share this one with friends. I might keep all of these for me. And so since we know that the pastries are on point in this box, I wanted to try something a little bit different. And I wanted to try these little soy-flavored crackers that are called Sakura Arare because they're shaped like little sakura blossoms. Just to see kind of what they're like. Those are so crispy. I don't even know what to compare them to, but that's spectacular. And so if any of these snacks looked interesting to you, then I highly recommend that you get your own Sakurako box. And if you want to get $5 off your first order, make sure to use my affiliate code ThoughtB to get that money off and enjoy your Hanami picnic from home. And now that we've had some light refreshments, let's get back to Gristol. And so, in typical Psychonauts fashion, our expectations are completely subverted when we try to take a bite of this caviar, because they're revealed to be the giant Fabergé eggs that Raz needs for the display that will in turn represent the wealth and prosperity of Grulovia. And while I don't think we need any more evidence to prove this point, this entire area just further illustrates to us Gristol's inherent grandiosity and preoccupation with his royal lineage and everyone around him who he believes to be important. You deliver this egg to him on a literal red carpet as a Gregorian chant-esque version of the song that's been playing throughout the entire level plays in the background, with giant portraits of his family, other beautiful Fabergé eggs, and his stupid gaudy crown thing looming all throughout this ethereal platforming section. And once we get the egg to where it needs to go, the propagandineer allows us to continue forward with the ride. However, this is when we finally get to see some of the more sinister sides of Gristol. Because up to this point, yes, he has shown some definitive narcissistic tendencies and a lot of manipulative tactics. However, he himself has not brought any definitive harm to the people around him. But he will. From this point forward, the ride begins to recap the death of Tsar Theodore through the children's song and how Gristol wants to be perceived. Gristol needs the excessive admiration he feels that he deserves, and now that he has the hope of using Maligula as a means to get what he wants, he comes out of the seemingly depressive state that he had fallen into in the Lady Luctopus, and he began to take action. This is where the song sung by the children that we have all become so painfully familiar with over the course of the game starts to shift into Gristol's voice. We realize that everything we have seen and heard up to this point was actually him singing it. It really establishes where Gristol is developmentally. While a significant amount of time has passed since the exile of his family, he has been stuck in this childlike frame of mind ever since. If we look at the ideas outlined in Kohlberg's 6 stages of moral development, we can see more and more as the level progresses that he is definitely in stage 2, or the self-interest stage of moral development, which, when boiled down to its most basic elements, is when an individual very much takes an eye for an eye mentality when interacting with the people around them. While it is rare that this stage persists to adulthood, it's definitely possible, which is represented in Gristol Malik. All of his actions are geared towards garnering the greatest benefit for himself, and he may literally not even be able to see the perspective of those around him and why these actions may not be okay. And so again, these childlike voices merging with Gristol's voice just show to us without a shadow of a doubt that they are simply one in the same and likely always have been. And moving forward, this is where we see his actions begin to become much more serious than could be explained simply by the narcissistic tendencies and stunted moral development we've seen up to this point, but also due to some pervasive antisocial tendencies. If you're not familiar with the term antisocial, in the world of psychology and mental health, it doesn't refer to someone who just doesn't enjoy being around people. That would describe someone who is asocial. Antisocial behavior is defined by the APA as denoting or exhibiting behavior that sharply deviates from the social norms and also violates other people's rights, with arson and vandalism being examples of antisocial behavior. In Gristol's mind, he is the hero of this story, and he will go to incredibly heinous and extreme lengths in order to accomplish his mission. We get a nice callback to the Whispering Rock Psychic Summer Camp from the first Psychonauts, where we see that he had actually gone there to find Ford Cruller. But when he realized this was a dead end, he instead infiltrated the Psychonauts, taking on the persona of Nick from the mailroom in order to gain the trust of the Psychonauts. And this is where he begins to cross some pretty well-defined lines, skewing into more severe antisocial behaviors. However, since we're not familiar with his behaviors before he was 15 years old and whether or not he would have been diagnosed before this point, which is a requirement for an antisocial diagnosis. I don't feel comfortable giving the definitive diagnosis of an antisocial personality disorder, though according to the DSM-5, this personality disorder is more prevalent with populations who have been affected by adverse sociocultural factors. And while it's undeniable that Gristol was raised with a silver spoon in his mouth, with the upheaval of his nation and his father's position, I think it's definitely fair to say he has faced some drastic socio-cultural changes in his lifetime, especially since it appears he was quite young when the many tragedies that befell Grulovia and his family had happened. And so the ride shows us Gristol replacing Truman Zanotto's brain with his own so that he could take charge of the Psychonauts, which, let's be honest, even just going undercover in the Psychonauts for his nefarious plan, if we're looking at the criteria for antisocial personality disorder, would fall under the category of deceitfulness as indicated by repeat lying, use of aliases, or conning others for personal profit or pleasure. So, taking it a step further and essentially body snatching the head of an international organization, I believe would probably fall under another piece of criteria for antisocial personality disorder, for failing to conform to societal norms with respect to lawful behavior, which can be indicated by repeatedly performing acts that are grounds for arrest. This utter lack of remorse whenever he manipulates the people around him in order to achieve his goals, with him even having the presence of mind to know that he was a puppeteer controlling Raz at this portion of the ride, could also be an indication of his narcissistic inclinations, which is what makes Gristol such an incredibly compelling antagonist. Gristol doesn't appear to care about anyone but himself and his own personal desires, and he will do whatever it takes, whether it be crime, manipulation, mental abuse like what we see him do to Dr. Loboto to make this poor man acquiesce to his bidding, or whatever else he can think of to retake his position of power and prestige. And while I mentioned it earlier in the video, I can't stress enough that Gristol is an extreme case when it comes to these personality disorders and should never be considered as a good example for how either present themselves in the world. And please don't use him as such. He's essentially a caricature. Don't look to him as a way to demonize individuals with antisocial or narcissistic personality disorders, because it's not a like for like comparison. And there's just too much stigma in the world surrounding these personality disorders as is. Instead, Gristol should be considered as a cautionary tale of what can happen if an individual steeps in these kinds of thoughts for too long without any real support from the people around him. And so after this puppet master reveal, we are dumped into an arena surrounded by the shoddily constructed citizens of Grulovia who appear to be rioting, being attacked by censors dressed like Gristol, bad ideas, judgment, panic attacks, and doubts, before going into a backstage area where we are able to see Gristol forcing Loboto to remove Truman Zanotto's brain, and Gristol coercing Loboto never to reveal where he hid the brain. Again, showing his lack of remorse and deceitfulness. And because this is in a back area, not even in the main portion of this ride-like mind, it shows that he doesn't want anyone to know about his affiliation with Dr. Loboto. Yes, he is a crucial person in his mind, but he doesn't want people to know that he had any true association with Loboto. He was another means to an end. And once we finally enter into the final portion of his mind, we see just how arrogant Gristol truly is. This last bit almost feels like it was constructed specifically for Raz's benefit, to rub it in Raz's face that he had manipulated him throughout the entirety of the game to achieve his goals, and that he truly feels at this point that he has won. I mean, even just the cutouts of Gristol revealing his own brain, I don't know, it rubs me the wrong way. However, we also quickly begin to see just how far his mind has deteriorated over the past several years, because once we see the sign that proclaims Malik's the mole, again, immense gloating coming from Gristol, everything starts to deconstruct, showing bits and pieces from almost every part of the level, before becoming a black void with a dark hole at the end, which as we pass through illustrates his desires to drown the Psychic Six and rule over not only Grulovia, but also seemingly he wants to stand on top of the world with Maligula behind him all the way. Gristol has reached the point where being the Tsar isn't enough anymore, and instead he feels that he stands alone above all of humanity. The heralds should play songs for him because he is unrivaled in his greatness. Now, we all know that this isn't true, and it's just these delusions of grandeur getting the best of him, but this is genuinely his perception at this point, and these delusions mixed with his antisocial inclinations leads to a very dangerous combination when you add in the fact that he is essentially arming himself with a nuclear missile by resurrecting Maligula. And so when the ride ends, and in turn we enter the gift shop, we actually encounter Gristol once again, and we see his utter disconnect from reality as he and Raz talk. And essentially all this conversation does is to show us without a shadow of a doubt that everything we have seen over the course of this level is true. We understand that Gristol does not have the empathy for the plight of the people of Grulovia and how Maligula squelched their protests. We know that he sees nothing wrong with his actions, and we know that he thinks that restoring the country really just amounts to putting himself back into a place of power and prestige and lining his own pockets. Him being successful as the Tsar equates to the country's success. He hasn't thought about bringing wealth to the people, only to himself, and he will undoubtedly use Maligula to do so. And while you could look at Gristol as a villain, because that's certainly how he's framed to appear, in reality, yes, he's the antagonist, but like I said, he's a cautionary tale. We've discussed that yes, he has done terrible things, but it's not as though this couldn't have been prevented, at least in part. Gristol is a man whose parents pampered him and likely overevaluated him, and gave him everything he could have ever wanted, barring warmth and care. And so if he was naturally predisposed to these narcissistic and antisocial behaviors, without any recognition or early intervention by the people around him, this caused him to continue to spiral through his isolation in the Lady Luctopus, with what I imagine to be very minimal support. And so is it shocking that he ended up the way he did? Not in the slightest. And unfortunately, this is the mind that when we leave, nothing's really changed. Raz doesn't make much of a difference. While in most other minds Raz enters, he's able to help them in their journeys to begin overcoming what might be troubling them, acting as a helper as they come to the revelations they need to come to so that they could move forward all on their own 2 feet. But this doesn't happen with Gristol. Instead, Gristol, because he is completely unwilling to accept help at this point, both literally and metaphorically, he ties Raz's hands. And Raz needs the help of Lili just to escape in time to stop Maligula. And so while I wish it could be different, Gristol's mental world never gets a resolution. He enacts his plan to resurrect Maligula, and Raz has to stop her. I think that this is an amazing example of the fact that no counselor or helping professional can impose their will on someone. If you are genuinely trying to work with someone in a therapeutic and morally correct capacity, if they are unwilling to work together with you, then you'll have a very hard time making any meaningful or positive progress with this individual until they feel comfortable enough to open up to you and accept that help. Gristol is a great representation of the fact that there's no simple path, and if an individual does not take ownership or responsibility of their own mental health and well-being, then it may become even more of a long and arduous path for them than it otherwise would have been. Every single character in Psychonauts 2 is written astonishingly well, and whether it's Lucretia or Gristol, there are no enemies who you can't at least see how they reach the point that they have. The point of this area is not to demonize or dehumanize individuals with either narcissistic or antisocial personality disorders. It's to show that no matter who you are speaking to, no matter what they may have done, they are still a person. They still have their own struggles, and no one is beyond redemption and growth. Regardless of how chronic their struggles may be, some symptoms can be mediated over time, and people can grow. And this is alluded to at the end of the game. him, we can see him actually showing some level of self-reflection internally, even though in the real world he's still very evasive whenever you try to talk to him, which is a definite step in the right direction. If we are able to see another Psychonauts game, which I would love, I would like to see just how far he can develop. While becoming Czar is likely forever out of the question for him, who knows, maybe Gristol could someday turn out to be okay. I mean, if we can have the capacity to forgive Coach Oleander and Dr. Loboto, I think that Gristol deserves a second chance as well. But that'll do it for this week's video, guys, and I want to pass the question off to you. What do you think of Gristol Malik? Do you think he's redeemable? Is he not? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, why not liking the video, why not subscribing to the channel, and why not even ringing that notification bell so you never miss another upload. And if you want to see more Psychonauts content coming from this channel, make sure to share this video wherever you like sharing things, whether it's Twitter, Reddit, or anywhere else. And as always, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, a fantastic rest of your week, and why not even a fantastic rest of your month. And I will see you in the next video. Later.